Morning. We're back for another Marine Science in the Morning. These are being recorded and they'll be up on the YouTube, the Marine Ecosystems Exhibit YouTube channel sometime in the near future if you want to come back and review it. Today we're lucky enough to have somebody from outside SMS. This is Dr. Conor MacDonnell. He's from Florida Oceanographic Society. He's a marine ecologist focusing on seagrasses, which is an important ecosystem for both of our charismatic megafauna in the area and our coastal communities. He received his BS from William and Mary, his MS at FGCU, and where he studied the roles of mangroves in methane production and water quality improvement. Florida Gulf Coast Community, or Florida Gulf Coast University, which is what FGCU is. And he got his PhD in soil and water sciences at the University of Florida, where he studied the effectiveness of multiple seagrass restoration techniques in various subtropical environments in Florida. Conor's current research interests include improving the effectiveness and efficiency of seagrass restoration with an emphasis on incorporating public outreach and awareness. Now we will have Q&A available. So if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I will answer those that I feel that I can answer, and anything else I will defer to Conor at the end, and we'll take questions there. With that, Conor, welcome. And if you want to share your screen with us or say anything and then share your screen, we'll get started.
Well, thank you for the introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be presenting to you guys. And I'm really excited to talk about an ecosystem that's very important for the function of not only the Indian River Lagoon, but of a lot of the state of Florida, both for ecosystem services, as well as for the culture and the safety of our local coastal communities. So today I'm going to be talking about seagrasses, why they're important, their current trends, their decline, and opportunities for restoration. And included in that last section, I'm going to be talking about a research project that I conducted back in 2018. It was recently published in a high impact journal regarding the uses of different fertilizers for improvements to seagrass growth in nursery settings. So before we really get started, the most important question to ask is, what are seagrasses? Because that can be a little more complicated than one would first think. So seagrasses are an aquatic plant. They've been around for tens of millions of years. I've actually had the pleasure of holding that fossil that's in the picture there from the Florida Museum. So they've been around for millions of years, and they're found all over the world's coasts. And if you took all the seagrass in the world and put them in one area, it'd be approximately the size of Texas. So there's a lot of seagrass, and it's been around for a very, very long time. This is a quick video showing a pristine seagrass bed that I had the pleasure of filming off of Homosassa, Florida. So that's by Crystal River, or if you're not familiar, north of Tampa, Florida, about an hour. So that's turtle grass. And you can see in the background some fish that feed on the seagrasses and the organisms that grow on top of the seagrasses, the epiphytes. So one question I get asked a lot about, especially by locals, is what's the difference between seagrasses or seaweeds? So when stuff's washing up on the beach, is that slimy stuff like a seagrass, or is it a seaweed? And if you're out identifying potential seagrass habitats, sometimes it can be difficult to tell the difference. But generally, seagrasses are a plant, whereas seaweeds are typically classified as algae or protists, plant-like protists. Seagrasses will have specific structures for photosynthesis and for structural support, so like leaves versus stems, whereas kelps and seaweeds will photosynthesize throughout the entire structure. And then another thing to note is that seagrasses have actual roots, whereas seaweeds do not. They only have holdfasts, which will keep the algae attached to the ground. So what's so amazing about seagrasses? A lot of people just think of seagrasses as, the aquatic equivalent to the grass that grows in their lawn. But seagrasses actually are much more important than that. Firstly, they help provide us with shelter for commercially relevant fish species. So they provide approximately $78 billion per year in food production. So they contribute to habitats, and they provide shelter and food for organisms that grow into things that we eat. They also help clean our water through nutrient cycling, and that's worth approximately $2 trillion per year. And finally, but certainly not least, they help protect us from storms and waves. So they help slow and reduce the storm surge by slowing down the currents, literally just being in the way. And you might think that, a seagrass that's about this tall wouldn't really slow down a current, but if you're considering acres, miles and miles of seagrass, that really makes a significant difference, and that can have tangible effects on the impacts of storms for our coastal communities. Speaking of seafood, this is one organism that you can see right here that is particularly valuable, especially lately, the stone crab. And that was a photo I took in Homosassa of a stone crab using a seagrass bed, similar to how a rabbit would use a grassland. So he's dug himself a hole where he can stay safe and he can nibble on different organisms without getting attacked by larger fish. This is a quick video of a porcupine fish, which, while it doesn't have any value as a seafood commodity to my knowledge, it's one of my favorite organisms that I find on a seagrass bed. So now we get to the less pleasant part of the presentation, where I talk about how this great ecosystem is in a lot of trouble. So unfortunately, seagrasses have been on the decline worldwide, and it's a decline that is accelerating. So I believe in 1980, from 1980 to 2000, the average percentage decline of seagrasses was at least 50% less than it is today, which is approximately 7% per year. So this is due to both direct human disturbances, so your boat groundings, your development, building piers that will disturb the seagrasses, dredging, but indirect effects tend to have the greatest aerial impact. So we're talking about eutrophication, where the water quality is devastated, and that can be due to septic. It can be due to agricultural runoff. We'll talk more about that later in the presentation. Climate change can also play a role because it affects the severity of storms, which then have a direct impact on seagrasses. And we've seen that in some parts of Florida, where a hurricane will hit seagrasses, and due to changes in their environment, like other changes that increase the stress level, the seagrasses don't return like they used to. So we find that seagrasses decline and then they don't return. And then every time a hurricane hits, it's a smaller and smaller pool of seagrass. To make matters worse, restoring seagrass is really difficult. So there's only a 37% success rate estimated for seagrass restoration. And that's less than coral reefs. And coral reefs are considered an ecosystem that is difficult to restore. Seagrasses are also expensive to restore. They don't follow the economy of scale typically associated with restoration, where the larger the area you restore, typically the cheaper the restoration per acre would be. That's not typically the case with seagrasses. So per hectare, per a couple acres, it can cost from $80,000 to over $1.5 million just to restore a relatively small area of seagrass. And then when you combine that with the low success rate, you can understand why it can be difficult for governments or other organizations to want to try to restore seagrasses, because it seems like a losing effort. So focusing more on the state of Florida, we've seen a decline of seagrass approximately 50% from the 1950s to the 2000s. And more recently, one of the worst hit areas, the poster child of seagrass loss in Florida, has been the Indian River Lagoon, where we've lost, in the span of only a few years, over half of our seagrasses. And this has been primarily due to an increase in nutrients. So that's going back to our eutrophication. Basically, nitrogen and phosphorus increases in the system, they increase the amount of algae. And when the algae dies, then that can kill the entire ecosystem. It sucks the oxygen out of the water, it increases toxic sulfide levels, and it makes the water darker. And the seagrasses they need light. So when there's less light availability, and you can see that in the top right image, a healthy seagrass bed versus the seagrasses currently in the Indian River Lagoon, there's not a lot left, partially because the color of the water's changed. It's gotten darker. There's more algae in the water that's absorbing light. And as a result, the seagrasses basically, they starve and die. There are also other disturbances, more direct disturbances. So boats, erosion, as well as commercial activities have also had a significant impact on seagrasses. And you can see in the below right corner graph showing the decline of seagrasses in the Indian River Lagoon over the years. And it's truly been catastrophic. And we've seen the consequences of seagrass loss expressed in losses of charismatic megafauna like manatees. Manatees need 100 pounds of seagrass approximately every single day to remain healthy. And when we have such catastrophic seagrass losses like we've seen in the Indian River Lagoon, those manatees starve and die. And we've seen that in record numbers. This graph is actually not current. Approximately 1,100 manatees died in 2021. So additionally, we're losing a lot of our culture too, because the culture of sport fishing in Florida, which drives a lot of our tourism and our jobs, has been threatened by the loss of seagrasses, because fish like your sea trout, your red drum, bonefish, a lot of those organisms depend on seagrasses in one way or another. Blue crabs, stone crabs, those organisms are also highly dependent on seagrasses. So when you lose those seagrasses, you lose all of those organisms, which are either commercially or recreationally important. And then as a result, you lose that culture. The people either move or they stop fishing. So it's a tragedy both for our environment, but also for our coastal communities and the people that live in them. So now we're going to talk a little bit about seagrass restoration, some success stories, the limitations of seagrass restoration, and some of the work that I've had the pleasure of doing in an effort to help innovate seagrass restoration to improve that really low success rate and to increase the availability of seagrasses for future efforts. So interestingly enough, the first seagrass restoration was conducted in 1937. So we've known for a relatively long time that seagrasses are important. However, seagrasses have still been relatively understudied compared to other coastal ecosystems like coral reefs. There are a couple ways to go about seagrass restoration. You have passive actions, which involves improving water quality. You're not directly impacting the bottom. You're not directly planting seagrasses. That's what active restoration is. Where you're taking seedlings and you're planting them in an environment that you believe can hold seagrasses or has improved to the degree that the seagrass restoration can be successful. So in the lower right-hand corner, you see an example of this active restoration, where you take seedlings or clone fragments of seagrasses, and you can either plant them bare root with an anchor, like a staple or like a stake, or you can wrap them in soil, which tends to do better because the seagrasses will experience less transplantation shock. They have a microbial community. And you can also add fertilizers that can help boost the growth and overcome nutrient limitations that we'll discuss more in a minute. So some really interesting examples of successful seagrass restoration have been in Tampa Bay, where both passive, so water quality improvements, and active strategies, so actually going out and planting, have synergized really well together, and at least for a time resulted in seagrass areas that were greater than the 1950s, so approximately World War II era, which was an amazing accomplishment that has only been somewhat tarnished by more recent issues like the Piney Point disaster, as well as some reductions in water quality in areas. I believe in St. Petersburg, they've had some reductions, which has then resulted in a significant loss of seagrass, but it's still much better than it used to be, especially in the 80s and 90s. Another success story with a related species of aquatic grasses, tape grass, that lives in freshwater, has been in Crystal River, where they returned. Basically, what happened was that there was nutrient pollution, and I believe there was a storm that wiped out the seagrass, and then the algae grew in its place, and it reduced the water quality. I remember going back, I believe it was 2016, and it was sort of a joke that Crystal River was actually crystal clear. But recently, when I came by last year, Crystal River actually held true to its name because the community came together. They worked with companies, so Scene Shoreline, and they basically sucked the muck, the nutrient-rich muck, off the bottom. They planted the tape grass, and then since then it's flourished. And most times of the year, you can actually see manatees. It used to be that only in the wintertime the manatees would come by for the warmth, but now they stick around because Crystal River is full of grass as well. So it's really heartwarming to see that at least some parts of Florida are experiencing some positive returns from the efforts that we put in to try to restore an ecosystem that is extremely sensitive and typically has a low chance of success. Of course, that being said, there are still limitations to seagrass restoration. Its low success rate, which is illustrated in the top right graph, it has the lowest restoration success rate of the different coastal ecosystems. Part of that reason is because we don't fully understand how seagrasses interact with their environment, or if the environment is hostile to seagrasses. We know the general factors that will impact seagrasses, but it's difficult to have someone go out and take multiple samples and really investigate, is the current, are the waves too strong? Am I planting at the right depth? Another problem is the transplantation shock, where seagrasses, when they get exposed to an environment that has a different biogeochemistry, that has herbivores, usually these seagrasses are grown in nurseries, so they don't have to deal with herbivores. They don't have to deal with a hostile environment with heavy currents and waves. So it can be hard to mitigate for those factors when you're planting seagrasses. So one of the things that we're trying to work on is innovating seagrass restoration, trying to address some of those factors that stress seagrasses so that we can further improve that really low success rate and hopefully make seagrass restoration less expensive as well. So the subject of my research that I conducted was nutrient enhancement, which is one of the ways that we can help reduce the transplantation stress of seagrasses and help boost their growth in order to improve the quantity of seagrass that's in an environment and increase that success rate. So basically, nutrient enhancement involves fulfilling the nutrient limitations present at a restoration site. And typically that will be nitrogen or phosphorus. And you can do this either with like direct use of fertilizers. For example, the fertilizer on the right, that's Osmocote, that granular fertilizer, it's slow release. And then you have the more indirect approach, which has been used especially in seagrass scar restoration, which is the use of bird stakes, where birds will roost on the stakes and will naturally defecate into the water. And basically it focuses the nutrients from the bird in a particular environment or in one particular place so that it helps boost the seagrass growth in that area. However, there are some limitations to this technique. Obviously, you don't want to be putting too much fertilizer into an environment, especially one that could be stressed with nutrients. So you really don't want to be doing this in parts of the Indian River Lagoon that are already eutrophic. It won't have a significant effect, and you're just going to be putting pollutants into the water. Another issue is that you can have a variable amount of nutrients outputted. So for example, with the bird stakes, you don't know how many birds are roosting on it. You don't know what the rate of nutrient input is, and you don't know how long you need to have the stakes out there for the seagrasses to get the benefit. Because if you leave the stakes for too long a period of time, you can then have like a small eutrophic event where algae can grow. It can outcompete the seagrasses, and you don't want that. Another problem with the use of fertilizers, at least direct fertilizers, is that we're depleting our phosphorus resources, especially. And phosphorus mining has a high environmental footprint and can have unexpected costs. For example, Piney Point, or if you've been through Central Florida, and seen the giant mosaic mines, it's insane, and it has a significant impact on the environment. So there's been a shift recently to move towards wastewater derived nutrients, partially because it's a method of extracting nutrients that would possibly otherwise become pollution down the line, but also because it can provide locally sourced, sustainable material that you're not mining for. You're basically just extracting it from resources that you currently have. So we experimented with such a fertilizer that is wastewater derived. It's called struvite. It has nitrogen and phosphorus as well as magnesium. So it's a wastewater byproduct that's been used in terrestrial ecosystems with success. And it's also sparingly soluble, so it dissolves very slowly in an alkaline aquatic environment, which just happens to be what ocean environments are. They're alkaline environments, and if the fertilizer is dissolving very slowly in the environment, that can mean that there are less outputs into the environment or out of the nursery. And it could also mean that the seagrasses are going to be getting more of a benefit from the struvite if it's buried in the soil, because the seagrasses actually reduce the pH. They have areas in the root system, the rhizosphere, where they can reduce the pH slightly, and they emit enzymes that actually can feed off of fertilizers and other minerals. And that's how they can get their nutrients when they're in an environment that's nutrient poor. So we can sort of harness that with struvite. So what we ended up doing is we compared the growth of seagrasses using a common fertilizer used in seagrass restoration, the osmocote that's at the top. And then we compared that with the struvite as well as a control that was not fertilized. More specifically, our objectives were to determine differences in seagrass performance, so shoot count, length, biomass, with the addition of these different fertilizers. And we also investigated shifts in pore water nutrients that were caused by the addition of fertilizers. So we wanted to see how fast the seagrasses would grow depending on the different fertilizer addition. And then we also wanted to see how the fertilizers behaved in the environment, how quickly they released their nutrients, and if that might pose a problem, like when you're considering pollution or even just cost, because you don't want to constantly replace fertilizers to boost seagrass growth if your seagrasses or your fertilizers are constantly dissolving. You want to have a fertilizer that sticks in the environment, that very slowly releases nutrients, and is targeted towards the species of choice, in this case, the seagrass. So we conducted our experiment in a large mesocosm. It was 6 meters wide. It's basically just a large tank in Marineland, Florida, with the Whitney Lab of Marine Biosciences. And we had 2 different experiments. The first experiment worked with a singular dose of fertilizer based off of the phosphorus content, so the milligrams of phosphorus per dry weight gram of sediment, because we assumed that the environment was phosphorus limited. And then we had a second experiment where we worked with much smaller doses. So 1/50th 1/20th and then 1/10 the dose of the original. And I'll talk more about that next slide, why that was. And we measured shoot count, blade length, above and below ground biomass, and we also measured the pore water, total dissolved nitrogen, and total dissolved phosphorus, or the TDN and TDP. So in our first experiment, we found that struvite performed significantly better than the osmocote and the control in terms of shoot count. And we also found that the amount of total dissolved phosphorus was extremely high. This is a logarithmic graph on the bottom. This is not a linear graph in a sense. It's the osmocote treatment had 50 times higher quantities of phosphorus being emitted into the pore water spaces. So basically, that's where the phosphorus dissolves into the water that's like in the sediment and available to the seagrass. But eventually, that's of course going to be diffused into the water column. So what we found is that the struvite was significantly helpful for the seagrasses in terms of shoot count. And then we also found that the phosphorus emissions from the osmocote were excessively high. And we don't have nitrogen measurements. Well, we tried taking a few, but even with 100 times dilution, it was still too high for our instruments to read. So, and that's something that we observed with the plants after we conducted this study, is that the osmocote, which is on the far left, these are all approximately to scale, looked like it had experienced some kind of root burn, which is basically an excessive amount of nitrogen. So the osmocote was releasing so much nitrogen that it was actually negatively affecting the growth of the seagrass. And you can see this because the control that wasn't fertilized with anything has more root biomass. And you can see that the struvite also has a lot of biomass, but it also has longer shoots and performed a lot better than the other two treatments. So we wanted to decrease the amount of fertilizers that we use in order to really investigate, at the lowest concentrations, how would the seagrasses be affected? Would there still be this root burn, or would the osmocote perform well? And what we found is that the struvite still performed better than osmocote treatments, at least in terms of total biomass. And we found that the medium dose of struvite performed the best. It performed better than the medium osmocote treatment, and it also performed better than the low osmocote treatment. And we also found, again, that the osmocote was typically releasing more total dissolved phosphorus and total dissolved nitrogen than the struvite treatment. So basically, from this whole presentation, what we can take away is that seagrasses are an extremely important ecosystem, both for the environment and for the coastal communities that thrive and interact with it. The restoration of seagrasses, responding to the decline that we've experienced in the last 50 years, has had some significant successes, but there are some significant improvements that need to be made to make restoration not only more effective, but also cheaper, to get more government, nonprofit, and other bodies involved to really reverse some of the trends that we've experienced. And research is a really critical part of innovating this restoration. And projects like the one that I've worked on with struvite can help improve the effectiveness and the efficiency of seagrass restoration. So with that, I'll now take any questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys today.
Okay, if there are any questions, if we could put them into the Q&A, now would be a good time. Thanks, Connor. Are you guys seeing, like, where you work, you guys are actively working on seagrass restoration. So are you implementing struvite as your choice for when you're developing protocols or advising other organizations?
So we haven't worked with struvite yet, but we are going to be doing some new trials, working with different species of seagrass. There is a private company, Aquatech, that is working with my advisor for my PhD. And we're going to be working together on a struvite seagrass project, but they're already actively using struvite in their nurseries.
Mhm.
So there are a couple like key applications of where struvite would be most effective. You don't want to be throwing it into environments with seagrasses. You want to be very precisely, surgically applying struvite in environments that either have a significant nutrient limitation or in nursery environments where you want to increase the growth of seagrasses significantly. So that's the directions that we're going in currently.
So one of the issues, Dean Janiak and I here spend a lot of time in the lagoon working on oyster surveys and seagrass surveys. And one of the things that we've seen, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, is that we've seen the decline in the 6 years I've been here, 6+ years. I've seen a huge decline in the seagrass and the oyster beds that are in this local area. But it seems like the real issue is the cause of the decline. It's one thing to develop restoration protocols that are effective and cheap, but if we just keep throwing them into the water when the water quality is so bad, it seems kind of pointless. I mean, are you aware of what's going on in terms of trying to get to the root cause of some of these problems, or what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and it's interesting how the issues are different depending on what section of the Indian River Lagoon you're looking at. For example, as you know, the Lake Okeechobee start releasing again, which has already had a negative effect on our water quality in the St. Lucie River area. And that also releases nutrients into the environment and can significantly disrupt it. So they're working towards releasing less from Lake Okeechobee. They're working on doing septic to sewer conversions, a very expensive but important effort. So yeah, certainly there are some significant actions that need to be taken to improve the environment before significant restoration can take place. But there are ways to at least somewhat mitigate those factors in restoration, at least by trying to make some improvements to seagrass restoration. You can have the seagrasses grow in some environments that they might not have otherwise using older techniques. But I agree that the first step is really trying to reduce the quantity of nutrients into the environment so that these ecosystems can grow by themselves, but also so that we can plant other species of seagrasses. Like there's a lot of halidulae in the Indian River Lagoon, for example, but there's not nearly as much Syringodium as there used to be. So one of my efforts has been to work on increasing the quantity and availability of Syringodium so that when the water quality does improve significantly, the Syringodium can be planted in a lot of different areas and help accelerate the process of returning a healthy biodiversity to the lagoon.
Yeah, it seems like if Tampa could muster the political will to deal with the root causes, that should be something we can't do over here. So, especially
Yeah, I'd hope.
Yeah, especially now that the governor's actually ponied up some funds for dealing with those issues.
Yeah. We have reservoirs that are being, I think it's the C44 reservoir that's being worked on right now. And once that gets online, that'll also significantly help divert the overflows into, at least into our watershed, but also help regulate the flows going to the Caloosahatchee River. Because that's been a significant issue there. When I was working at Florida Gulf Coast University, there were significant, we'd get red tide and then we'd get green tide almost at the same time because the green tide from Lake Okeechobee would go through and then the red tide would feed off of some of the nutrients that would be pouring out of Okeechobee and our septic. So.
Dean posted in the webinar chat, it would seem that a good method would be to continuously dump seeds into the water rather than add nutrients to an already nutrient-rich system. This worked great in the mid-Atlantic. The problem I see is that our grasses are hard to get to flower. More effort in getting seeds might be useful. Is that?
Yeah, so I believe what he's referencing is the successful effort with Zoster and Marina in the Chesapeake Bay, which I actually had the pleasure of visiting. It's the largest seagrass restoration site on Earth, I think. And certainly adding seeds, having a seed bank is an important factor in increasing growth. Typically, restoration uses clonal fragments. So it's definitely a good idea to have different tacks to try to go from different angles. Although, of course, the one of the biggest solutions is going to be improving the water quality, reducing the flows, and reducing the amount of septic tank runoff that's coming in. But yeah, I've talked to a few people about potentially using seeds. It depends on the species too. Like some seeds are really hard to access. Some are extremely small, for example, or the flowering or the seeding is extremely brief. But
okay, we don't have any more questions up. Last call. If anybody has anything? Thanks, Connor. I know, at least from my perspective, this is an important thing. I mean, because I see the direct result of what's been happening and our lack of seagrass in the area. So it was interesting for me. We have a seminar again in 2 weeks. That's going to be Ken Gioeli from the UF Natural Resources Extension agent for St. Lucie County. He's going to be talking about non-native reptiles in the Treasure Coast. So I'm sure he'll tell us a lot about red-headed agamas and iguanas. So if nothing else, we'll call it a day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.